My name is Margaret Bennett, and the night my in-laws laughed about me in French, I slowly put down my fork and answered them in their own language. The room went completely silent. My mother-in-law's face drained of color. My father-in-law stopped with his wine glass halfway to his lips, and my husband Daniel stared at me as though I had just revealed that I had been living under a false name for our entire marriage. Then I looked directly at Henri and said in perfectly fluent French, "If you're going to decide my future, at least have the courtesy to let me hear the discussion." Nobody moved. That was the moment I stopped being the polite American wife they thought they could dismiss. But the story really began several hours earlier in my kitchen in Dublin, Ohio, when I was standing over a roasting pan wondering whether the potatoes needed another 5 minutes. I was 61 years old and I had been married to Daniel for 7 years. We lived in a comfortable 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood where people knew one another well enough to wave from their driveways, but not well enough to know everybody's business. I liked it that way. Our life wasn't glamorous. We paid our bills, argued about thermostat settings, watched the evening news, and went grocery shopping at Kroger on Saturday mornings. Daniel liked college football. I liked mystery novels and gardening. On Sundays, we usually called his parents in France. I had never met them in person. That changed when Henri and Colette flew to Ohio to visit us. I wanted everything to be right. I cleaned the house twice. I bought fresh flowers from the little market near our neighborhood. I polished the good silverware my mother had given me when I got married the first time years before Daniel. For dinner, I made roast chicken with rosemary mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds, and an apple pie from scratch. Daniel came into the kitchen while I was setting the table. "You're doing too much," he said. "I want them to feel welcome." "They'll feel welcome." I smiled at him. "They're your parents." He kissed my cheek. "You know they can be difficult." That sentence stayed with me. I should have asked what he meant. Instead I said, "So can you." He laughed. For a few hours everything seemed fine. Henri was charming at first. He complimented the house, though his eyes wandered around as if he were inspecting it. Colette brought a bottle of French wine and a small box of chocolates. She was elegant, silver-haired, and perfectly dressed even after a long flight from Paris. We sat around the dining table while Daniel tried to keep the conversation moving. They asked about my work, my family, and our neighborhood. Then, almost without warning, they began speaking French. I didn't mind. In fact, I almost smiled. They probably assumed I understood only a few words. What they didn't know was that I had taught French in an Ohio public high school for more than 20 years. French wasn't a language I had memorized for a vacation. It was part of my life. My mother had been a French teacher, too. When I was young, she used to bring home old French records and children's books. Later, I studied in Quebec and spent a summer in France. Daniel knew I could speak some French. He had no idea how much. At first, Henri and Colette simply made comments about the food. Then they criticized the house. Then they began talking about me. They assumed their language had created a wall between us. It hadn't. Colette glanced at me while pretending to reach for her wine. "She dresses like someone from a small town," she said. Henri chuckled. Daniel looked down at his plate. I kept eating. Then Colette said, "I don't understand what Daniel sees in her." My fork stopped for half a second. Daniel heard it too. He said something quickly in French, apparently telling them to stop. Henri waved him off. They continued. They talked about my age. They talked about my previous marriage. They wondered whether I had married Daniel because of his money. I felt my face grow hot, but I said nothing. Then Henri leaned closer to Colette. "What about the inheritance?" he asked. My heart began beating faster. Daniel's uncle had died 2 years earlier and left Daniel a substantial investment account. I had helped Daniel organize the paperwork after the estate settled. I had never claimed a penny of it. Henri knew that. Or at least he should have. Colette answered quietly. "She thinks she has a right to control it because she helped him." I looked at Daniel. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That hurt more than anything his parents had said. Then I heard the sentence that changed the entire evening. Colette said, "We didn't come all the way from France just to have dinner with her. We came because Daniel needs to leave before she takes everything." My fork touched the plate. Henri said they had already discussed a plan with Daniel. They wanted him to return to France. They wanted him to separate his finances. And they wanted him to make me look like the unreasonable wife who had pushed him away. Then Colette laughed softly. "She thinks she has him completely trapped." Something inside me finally went still. I looked around that table, the flowers, the candles, the half-eaten dinner I had spent hours preparing. I thought about all the years I had tried to make Daniel happy. I thought about the retirement account I had built myself. I thought about every time I had defended his parents when he complained about them. And I thought about the woman they believed was sitting silently at their table. She was gone. I placed my fork beside my plate, slowly, deliberately. Then I looked at Henri. I looked at Colette. Finally, I looked at my husband. And in flawless French I said, "If we're going to discuss my marriage, perhaps we should do it in a language everyone at this table understands." Henri nearly dropped his wineglass. Colette stared at me. Daniel's mouth fell open. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock above our kitchen doorway. Then Henri whispered, "You speak French." I leaned back in my chair. "I've spoken it for most of my adult life." Colette looked at Daniel. "You knew?" "No," he said quietly. And that was when I realized something much worse than being insulted. My husband had been sitting at that table listening to his parents discuss destroying our marriage, and he hadn't stopped them. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. "I think I said it's time we stopped pretending this is just a family dinner." For several seconds, nobody touched their dinner. The silence at that table felt heavier than the conversation that had come before it. Henri finally lowered his wineglass. "You understood everything." I nodded. "Every word." Colette looked at Daniel as if he had somehow betrayed her by not knowing. "You never told us," she said. Daniel shook his head slowly. "I didn't know." I almost laughed, but there wasn't anything funny about the situation. He genuinely hadn't known. Over the years, I had occasionally spoken French around the house. I had ordered meals in French when we traveled. I had corrected Daniel's pronunciation when he tried to impress me. But I had never made a point of demonstrating how fluent I was. It had never mattered. Until that night. Henri cleared his throat. "I apologize if there was a misunderstanding." "There wasn't," I said. I kept my voice calm. "That was not a misunderstanding." Colette folded her hands in front of her. "We were speaking privately." "In my house," I replied. Daniel finally looked at me. "Maggie, can we please talk about this without turning it into a war?" I stared at him. "A war?" He rubbed his forehead. "I didn't mean it that way." "Then tell me what you meant." He didn't answer. That was the first moment I realized I wasn't going to get the truth from him easily. So I pushed my chair back. "I need some air." I walked into the kitchen. My hands were trembling. Not because I was afraid of Henri or Colette. I had spent enough years teaching teenagers to know that fear wasn't always the loudest emotion in a room. Sometimes disappointment was louder. I stood at the kitchen counter and stared through the window at our backyard. It was dark outside, the porch light reflected against the glass, and beyond it I could barely make out the maple tree Daniel and I had planted after we moved into the house. 7 years earlier, I had believed I was building a permanent life. Now I wondered whether Daniel had been quietly building another one. A few minutes later, he came into the kitchen. "Maggie." I didn't turn around. "Did you know they were planning to talk about me tonight?" "No." "Did you know they wanted you to move back to France?" He hesitated. That hesitation was enough. I turned around. "How long?" He looked down. "It's complicated." "No, Daniel. It isn't. Either you've discussed it with them or you haven't." "I have." My chest tightened. "How long?" "A few months." I stared at him. "A few months." He nodded. "Your parents have been planning this for months, and you never thought I deserved to know." I wasn't sure what I wanted. "You knew what they wanted." He sat at the kitchen table. I was confused. I pulled out the chair across from him. "Then help me understand." Daniel looked older suddenly. Not 63. Older. Tired. "You know my parents don't trust you." "I know they don't like me." "They think you're controlling me." I shook my head. "Why?" He didn't answer. So I answered for him. "Because of the inheritance." His eyes lifted. I had hit the center of the problem. Daniel's uncle had left him money. Not millions, but enough to make people behave differently around him. Enough to make conversations about marriage, property, and retirement suddenly complicated. When we married, I had told Daniel that his inheritance should remain separate if that was what he wanted. I had my own pension. My own retirement savings. The equity in the house came from both of us. I had never needed his money. "I never asked for your uncle's money," I said. "I know." "Then why do they think I did?" "They've convinced themselves. And you've let them." He looked away. That hurt. More than the French. More than Colette's insults. More than Henri's assumptions. Because a marriage isn't destroyed by one rude comment at a dinner table. It is weakened by all the conversations that happen when one spouse isn't there. I took a breath. "What exactly have they asked you to do?" Daniel hesitated again. Then he said, "They want me to review some estate documents." "What documents?" Nothing finalized. That wasn't my question. He looked at me. They had an attorney in France prepare some paperwork. About your inheritance. Yes. Have you signed anything? No. I felt a little relief. Then he added, but they want me to. I stood up. Where are the papers? They're in my office. I want to see them. Maggie, I am not signing anything. I'm not accusing you of a crime. I'm asking to see documents that concern our financial future. He didn't move. Finally, he went upstairs. I followed him. His office was a small room at the front of the house. Daniel kept old tax returns there along with receipts, investment statements, and the paperwork he never wanted to organize. He opened a desk drawer. There was a thick envelope inside. My name was written on it. I stared at it. Why is my name on something you haven't shown me? I was going to explain. When? He had no answer. I took the envelope. Inside were several pages covered in legal language. Some were in English, some were in French. I understood both. The documents concerned Daniel's inherited assets and how they would be handled in the event of separation, death, or transfer. They weren't exactly what I feared, but they were designed to protect Daniel's inherited property while giving me very little protection if our marriage ended. I read silently. Daniel stood behind me. I didn't write these. I know. My parents sent them. I know. I haven't signed anything. I turned around. Then why did you hide them? He looked ashamed. I was afraid. Of what? Of disappointing them. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it excused him. It didn't. But because for the first time that evening he sounded honest. I put the papers back in the envelope. You should have been afraid of disappointing me. He closed his eyes. I know. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten divorce. I didn't call his parents. Instead, I did something they weren't expecting. I called my friend Linda. Linda had worked as a paralegal for decades before retiring. She lived 15 minutes away in Westerville and had known me since before Daniel and I married. When she answered, I said, I need the name of a good estate attorney. She immediately asked, what happened? I looked at Daniel. I'm not sure yet. That was the truth. I didn't know whether my husband had made a terrible mistake or whether he had been preparing to leave me. I only knew one thing. I was finished trusting assumptions. The next morning, Linda gave me the name of an attorney she trusted. Susan Keller had an office in Columbus and specialized in estate planning and family financial matters. I scheduled an appointment. Before I left the house, I looked at Daniel. We are going to find out what these papers really mean. He nodded. And after that, I said we're going to decide whether our marriage still has a future. He swallowed hard. I walked out the front door. I thought I was going to an attorney's office to understand a few documents. I had no idea I was about to discover just how much of our financial life my husband had been hiding from me. The next morning I drove to Columbus with the envelope of documents sitting on the passenger seat beside me. I kept telling myself not to jump to conclusions. That had always been one of my habits. When something went wrong, I looked for the reasonable explanation first. Maybe that was because I had spent most of my adult life teaching teenagers. You learned quickly that if you reacted to every strange thing a 17-year-old did, you'd spend your entire career exhausted. So I tried to be reasonable. Maybe Daniel's parents were simply overprotective. Maybe the documents were ordinary estate planning papers. Maybe Daniel had been frightened and confused. But one thought kept returning. He had hidden them from me. That wasn't confusion. That was a choice. Susan Keller's office was in a brick building near downtown Columbus. It wasn't flashy. There was no marble lobby or intimidating reception desk, just a quiet waiting room, a coffee machine, a few framed certificates, and a receptionist who spoke to me in the calm voice of someone who had seen every kind of family crisis. When Susan came out to greet me, she was in her late 50s with short gray hair and a practical expression. Mrs. Bennett. Yes. Come on back. I handed her the envelope. I need you to tell me what I'm looking at. She spent nearly 20 minutes reading through the documents. I watched her face. Finally, she placed the papers on the desk. These are not automatically bad documents, she said. I exhaled. But she continued I would not sign them without independent legal advice. Why? She pointed to several sections. These provisions strongly protect your husband's separate inherited property. Depending on the circumstances, they could leave you with fewer protections than you might reasonably expect after 7 years of marriage. I nodded slowly. That's what I was afraid of. Susan looked at me. Did your husband ask you to sign these? Not exactly. Who did? His parents. She raised an eyebrow. His parents. They're from France. They flew here yesterday. Susan leaned back. Do they have an attorney in France? Yes. Does your husband have independent counsel here in Ohio? Not that I know of. That needs to change. She didn't sound dramatic. That made her words more frightening. I told her about the dinner. I told her exactly what Henri and Colette had said. I even translated the parts they had spoken in French. Susan listened carefully. Then she asked, Did your husband know you understood French? Not like this. She nodded. Then there's something else you need to know. She opened another page. Have you seen this account number before? I looked down. My stomach tightened. Yes. It was connected to Daniel's investment portfolio. Susan tapped the page. There appears to have been a substantial transfer. How substantial? She told me. I stared at her. The amount was large enough to make my hands go cold. Where did it go? That she said is what you need to find out. I drove home with the windows cracked despite the cold. I needed air. When I walked through the front door, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table. He looked like he hadn't slept. How did it go? I put my purse down. Not well. He closed his eyes. I figured. Where did the money go? He looked at me. What money? I almost laughed. You know exactly what money. He was silent. Daniel. He rubbed both hands over his face. My sister needed help. Claire. He nodded. How much? He told me. It was a significant amount. I sat down. For a moment my anger softened. I knew Claire had been having financial problems in France. She had divorced several years earlier and had struggled to rebuild her life. I had even suggested that we help her once. But Daniel had said his family wouldn't accept it. Now I understood why. You sent her the money? Yes. Without telling me? Yes. Why? He looked embarrassed. My father would have been furious. And you thought I wouldn't understand. I didn't know. That answer frustrated me. You've been married to me for 7 years. You still don't know whether I would understand helping your sister? I was ashamed. That stopped me. Daniel wasn't looking at me anymore. He stared at the table. I told my parents I was handling everything he said. I didn't want them to know Claire needed money. I didn't want them to think I was failing. So you lied to them? Yes. And then you let them believe I was controlling your finances. He nodded. Why? Because it was easier. I sat back. There it was. The truth. Not a secret lover. Not some hidden double life. Something more ordinary and in some ways more painful. Cowardice. Daniel had been trying to keep everybody happy, and in doing so he had lied to everyone. His parents thought I was the problem. I thought his parents were the problem. And Daniel had been standing in the middle saying whatever he needed to say to avoid conflict. I looked at him. Do you love me? His eyes filled with tears. Yes. Then stop protecting me from the truth. He nodded. I will. I wanted to believe him. But trust isn't rebuilt because someone says the right sentence at the right moment. It is rebuilt through what happens afterward. That evening I went through our household records. Not because I wanted to invade Daniel's privacy. Because I needed to understand our financial situation. I found statements, transfer records, and correspondence. The money sent to Claire wasn't the only thing. There had been several smaller transfers over the previous year. I added them together. Daniel had sent a considerable amount to France. Some had gone to Claire. Some had gone toward expenses connected to his parents. And some were listed under vague descriptions that I didn't recognize. I brought the papers downstairs. Daniel looked at them. I can explain. I hope you can. He explained what he could. But there were still gaps. And those gaps frightened me more than the money itself. I called Susan again the next morning. She told me not to panic. She also told me not to sign anything. Then she gave me another piece of advice. Keep copies of every financial document you have access to legally, and don't confront his parents until you understand the entire picture. I agreed. That afternoon my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I answered. It was Colette. Her voice was quiet. I would like to meet you. Why? Alone. I looked out the kitchen window. Does Daniel know you're calling? No. Does Henri? No. There was a long pause. Then she said something in French. You deserve to know why we came. I closed my eyes. After everything she had said the night before, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. But I knew I needed the truth. Where? A coffee shop. When? Tomorrow morning. I agreed. After we hung up, I stood there holding the phone. I had spent my entire life believing that the truth was usually less frightening than the story we invented around it. Tomorrow I was going to find out whether that was still true. Because if Colette was finally ready to tell me why she wanted my marriage to end, I intended to listen. And this time nobody would be able to hide behind a language they thought I couldn't understand. The coffee shop Colette chose was a small place in Dublin, Ohio, tucked between a pharmacy and a nail salon. It wasn't the kind of restaurant where people dressed up. Retired couples came in for coffee, young mothers pushed strollers through the narrow aisles, and the same two men seemed to argue about baseball every morning. I arrived 10 minutes early. Colette was already there. She sat alone near the window, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. When I walked in, she stood. Maggie. Colette. For a moment, neither of us knew what to say. Then she looked toward the empty chair. Please. I sat down. She glanced around the room. I want to speak French. I almost smiled. Go ahead. Her expression changed. You really do understand everything. Yes. She looked down. I am ashamed. I didn't expect that. Not from her. You don't have to be ashamed of speaking French, I said. I am ashamed of what I said. That was different. I folded my hands on the table. Then tell me why. Colette took a slow breath. My husband and I have been afraid for our son. Afraid of me? Yes. Why? She hesitated. Because we have seen this before. I waited. She explained that years earlier a relative had married a woman who seemed charming and respectable. Over time, that woman had convinced him to move money-sell property and isolate himself from his family. Eventually, the marriage ended. The family lost money. But more importantly, Colette said they lost their son. He stopped speaking to us, she said, for years. I nodded. I understand why that hurt. But after that, Henry became suspicious of everyone. And you? I became protective. I looked at her. Protective doesn't explain what you said about me. No. She lowered her eyes. It does not. I let the silence sit between us. Then I asked the question I had wanted to ask since dinner. Who told you I was controlling Daniel? She didn't answer immediately. Daniel. My heart sank. What exactly did he tell you? That you questioned his spending. That you wanted to control his inheritance. That you were angry about money. I stared at her. Some of those things were technically true. I had questioned Daniel's spending. But only after he had started making large financial decisions without telling me. I had discussed his inheritance, but because I wanted to make sure we understood how it should be handled. And yes, I had been angry, but I had never demanded his money. Did he tell you why I questioned him? No. Did he tell you about the money he sent Claire? Her eyes widened. You know. Yes. Colette looked down. We asked him not to tell you. I felt something inside me break. Not because of Claire. Because they had deliberately kept me in the dark. Why? Because Henry was angry. Claire was already having problems. He thought Daniel should not be sending money. And Daniel, he wanted to help his sister. I nodded. That part I understood. But then why did you tell Daniel to separate his finances from me? Colette looked toward the window. Because we thought you were taking control. I leaned forward. Colette. I had no idea Daniel was sending money to Claire. If I wanted to control him, why would I have encouraged him to help her? She had no answer. Then I said quietly, you never asked me. She looked at me. No. You judged me before you knew me. Yes, that admission mattered. But it wasn't enough. I reached into my purse and pulled out copies of the documents Susan had reviewed. I placed them on the table. Do you recognize these? Colette stared at the papers. Yes. Who prepared them? An attorney in France. Did Daniel ask for them? She hesitated. No. Did you? She nodded. I felt my anger rise. So you arranged legal documents concerning my marriage without speaking to me. We wanted to protect Daniel. From what? She looked at me. From losing everything. I shook my head. He wasn't losing everything. You don't know that. I know my own finances. I told her about my pension, my retirement savings, and the home equity I had contributed. Then I told her something she clearly hadn't expected. I never wanted Daniel's inheritance. She stared at me. Not $1. Then why did you help him manage it? Because he asked me. That was the moment Colette's certainty began to crack. She had built an entire story about me. But she had never bothered to ask me whether the story was true. I pulled another document from my purse. This is from our financial records. She read it. Her face changed. It showed the transfers to Claire. Then she looked at me. Daniel told us you refused to help. I felt a strange mixture of sadness and anger. I didn't know she needed help. Colette covered her mouth. He said you didn't want him sending money to France. No. She stared at the table. For the first time, I saw the woman behind the judgment. She wasn't a cruel monster. She was a mother who had spent years terrified of losing her son. That didn't excuse what she had done, but it explained it. And sometimes understanding someone's fear makes their behavior easier to understand without making it acceptable. I need you to tell me one more thing, I said. What? Why did you come to America? Colette looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, we came because Henri wanted Daniel to return to France. My stomach tightened. Permanently. Yes. And you wanted him to leave me. She closed her eyes. We believed separation would be best. Based on what? Based on what Daniel told us. I sat back. There it was again. Daniel. My husband. The man who had told me he loved me. The man who had told his parents I was controlling. The man who had hidden money from everyone. I suddenly understood that I had been looking in the wrong direction. I had spent days thinking my in-laws were plotting against me. They were. But they couldn't have done it without information. And Daniel had been giving them that information. I stood up. I have to go. Colette reached for my hand. Maggie, please. I stopped.
What?
I don't want you to leave Daniel. I looked at her. You were trying to make him leave me. I know. Then what changed? She looked down at the papers. You? I waited. You came here. You listened. You didn't insult me. You didn't scream. You showed me the truth. She swallowed. I think I was wrong. Those were the first words she had spoken that sounded like an apology. But I wasn't ready to accept everything. I appreciate you saying that. She nodded. But if we're going to fix this, no more secrets. No more secrets. And I want Henri there. Her eyes widened. Why? Because he deserves to hear the truth too. Colette looked frightened. I continued. Tomorrow night everyone sits at my table. She was silent. And nobody speaks French to hide anything. A faint, reluctant smile appeared on her face. You really are serious? Yes. I picked up my purse. At the door I turned back. One more thing. Yes. I don't hate you. Her eyes filled with tears. But I won't allow you to decide my life again. She nodded. I understand. I walked outside. The morning air felt different. For the first time since that terrible dinner, I wasn't simply reacting. I had a plan. The next evening, Henri, Colette, Danielle, and I would sit around the same table. There would be no secret conversations, no carefully edited stories, no convenient misunderstandings. And before that dinner ended, every lie Daniel had told his parents, and every assumption they had made about me was going to come into the open. The next evening I set the table for 4. I didn't make anything fancy. After everything that had happened, I couldn't bring myself to spend hours preparing a meal designed to impress people who had already decided what kind of woman I was. So I made pot roast. It seemed appropriate. Something simple, something American, something that could sit in a slow cooker while the people around the table finally told the truth. At 6:30 the doorbell rang. Henri and Colette stood on the porch. Daniel was behind them. Nobody smiled. Come in, I said. Henri nodded. Thank you. We sat down. For once there was no French conversation. I had made sure of that. I looked around the table. This isn't a trial, I said, and I'm not here to humiliate anyone. Henri's shoulders relaxed slightly. But we're going to talk honestly tonight. Daniel nodded. Colette looked at him. Then she looked at me. I told Henri everything. Henri gave her a sharp glance. You told me some things. Then let me finish. Her voice was stronger than I expected. I served the pot roast. Nobody touched it. I placed a folder on the table. These are copies of the financial documents. Henri looked at Daniel. What is this? Daniel took a breath. They're documents my parents had prepared. For what? Daniel hesitated. I answered. To protect his inheritance. Henri frowned. That's not the whole story. No, I said, it isn't. Daniel finally spoke. I sent money to Claire. Henri's face changed. How much? Daniel told him. Henri pushed his chair back. You did what? I helped my sister. You were told not to. I know. And you hid it from us. Yes. Henri looked furious, but then something unexpected happened. He looked at me. Did you know? No. He looked back at Daniel. You told us she was controlling your finances. Daniel's face went pale. I was scared. Scared of what? Of disappointing everyone. Henri stared at his son. I had never seen a father look so confused by his own child. Daniel continued. I didn't want you to know Claire needed help. I didn't want Maggie to think I was making financial decisions without her. So I kept everything separate. You lied, Henri said. Yes. To us. Yes. To your wife. Daniel lowered his head. Yes. Silence settled over the table. I looked at Colette. She was crying quietly. I believed him, she said. I know. I believed he was unhappy. He was unhappy, I said, but not because of me. Daniel looked at me. I was unhappy because I felt trapped between everyone. I shook my head. You weren't trapped. What do you mean? You had choices. He stared at me. You could have told your parents the truth. Yes. You could have told me about Claire. Yes. You could have said you wanted to spend more time in France. He looked away. You could have trusted me enough to have a difficult conversation. His voice broke. I was afraid you'd leave. I felt my anger soften, but I didn't let it disappear. Daniel, you were so afraid I'd leave that you helped create the exact situation that could make me leave. He closed his eyes. That was the truth. And sometimes the truth hurts more when nobody argues with it. Henri reached for the folder. He read through the documents carefully. These were prepared by the attorney we contacted. Yes, Colette said. Henri looked at her. You arranged this? Yes. Without speaking to Maggie? Yes. He shook his head. I thought we were protecting our son. Colette whispered, so did I. Henri looked at me. I owe you an apology. I didn't say anything. He continued. I judged you. Yes. I believed you wanted Daniel's money. Yes. I believed you were separating him from us. Yes. I was wrong. The apology was sincere. I could hear it in his voice, but I wasn't ready to make everything disappear with 3 words. Thank you, I said. I accept your apology. Colette reached across the table. Maggie, I'm sorry too. I looked at her. You don't have to become my best friend. She gave a small smile through her tears. I don't think we could. I laughed softly. It was the first laugh we'd shared. But we can stop treating each other like enemies. She nodded. Then I looked at Daniel. There is still one thing I don't understand. He looked nervous. What? Why did you let your parents believe I wanted your inheritance? He stared at his plate. I told them you were asking questions about the account. That was true. I told them you wanted to know what would happen if something happened to me. That was true too. So they assumed you wanted control. And you didn't correct them. No. Why? He finally looked at me. Because part of me liked having an excuse. I frowned. An excuse for what? To avoid making decisions. That answer hurt. But it was honest. He continued. I didn't have to tell them I wanted to help Claire. I didn't have to tell them I wanted to spend more time in France. I didn't have to tell you that I sometimes felt torn between my life here and my family there. He took a breath. I let everybody believe a different version because I didn't want to disappoint anyone. I sat quietly. Then I said, you understand that you disappointed everyone anyway. He nodded. Yes. Henri looked at his son. You are not a child anymore. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I know. No, Henri said. I don't think you did. That sentence silenced all of us. For years, Daniel had allowed his parents to treat him like someone who needed permission. And I had unknowingly stepped into the same pattern by trying to solve problems for him. I realized something that night. My revenge couldn't be making Henri and Colette suffer. It couldn't be destroying Daniel's relationship with his parents, and it certainly couldn't be taking money I had never wanted. My revenge was going to be simpler. Everyone was going to live with the truth. I opened the folder one final time. I've already spoken with an attorney here in Ohio. Daniel looked at me. I know. I won't sign anything your parents arranged. He nodded. And neither will you until you've had independent advice. I agree. From now on, no secret accounts. Yes. No major financial decisions without telling each other. Yes. And your parents don't get to decide whether our marriage continues. Henri nodded slowly. I agree. Colette nodded too. Then I looked at Daniel. You're the one who has to decide whether you want this marriage. He looked at me for a long time. I do. I believed that he meant it. But belief wasn't enough anymore. Trust would have to be earned. That night, after Henri and Colette went upstairs to their guest room, Daniel and I remained at the kitchen table. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he said, Are you going to leave me? I looked at the man I loved. I don't know. His face fell. But I'm not leaving tonight. He nodded. That's something. Yes. I reached for my glass of water. There is one thing I need from you. What? No more protecting me from the truth. He nodded. I promise. I wanted to believe him. But there was still something he hadn't told me. I could see it in his face. A secret he was carrying alone. And the next morning he finally told me what it was. The next morning I woke before sunrise. For a few minutes I lay still and listened to the house. I could hear the furnace running downstairs and the faint creak of the old hardwood floor in the hallway. Everything sounded normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. I went downstairs and found Daniel sitting alone at the kitchen table. He had 2 cups of coffee in front of him. One was for me. I couldn't sleep, he said. Neither could I. I sat across from him. For a while neither of us touched the coffee. Then Daniel said, "There's something else you need to know." I looked at him. About what? France. My stomach tightened. I had known there was something more. What about France? He stared at his hands. I've been thinking about moving there. I didn't speak. Not forever, he added quickly. At least that's what I told myself. How long? Maybe 6 months, maybe longer. And you plan to tell me? Yes. When? He looked embarrassed. I don't know. I leaned back. So your parents weren't the only ones planning my future? He shook his head. No. Were they going to take you back to France? They wanted me to. And you wanted to go? Daniel took a breath. Part of me did. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I disliked France. I had been there myself years ago. I loved the countryside, the little cafes, the language, the history. But I had built my life in Ohio. Our life. I looked at him. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew you'd say no. I stared at him. You don't know that. I thought I did. You thought I would refuse to spend time in France. I thought you'd refuse to leave Ohio. Maybe I would have. He nodded. That's what scared me. I folded my hands. Daniel, you didn't give me the opportunity to have an opinion. I know. You made the decision for both of us. Yes, and then you let your parents believe I was the reason you were unhappy. His eyes filled with tears. I was ashamed. I shook my head. Stop using shame as an excuse for dishonesty. He looked at me. You're right. The simplicity of his answer surprised me. I had expected an argument. Instead, he simply accepted it. I stood and walked to the coffee maker. Outside, the first light was beginning to show behind the trees. Our neighborhood was waking up. A school bus passed at the end of the street. A man in a winter coat walked his dog. Someone's newspaper landed on a driveway. Ordinary life was continuing. That was one thing I had learned as I got older. Even when your world changes, the garbage still gets picked up on Tuesday. The mail still comes. The grocery store still opens. People still complain about traffic. And somehow you have to keep living while your heart catches up. I poured myself another cup of coffee. What exactly did you plan to do in France? Daniel looked toward the window. My parents have a small apartment near Lyon. I know. They wanted me to stay there for a while. And me? I thought you could visit. I almost smiled. Visit my own husband. He winced. I know how it sounds. It sounds like you were planning a separate life. I wasn't. You were considering one. He couldn't argue with that. I sat back down. For the first time, I wasn't angry. I was tired, deeply tired. Daniel, I don't need you to choose between your family and me. He looked at me. I need you to stop making me compete. He nodded. You're right. I don't want to be the American wife standing between you and your parents. You're not. I don't want to be the woman they blame every time you make a decision they dislike. You won't be. And I don't want to control where you live. He looked surprised. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to start having conversations like 2 adults. He looked down. I want to try. I know. No, Maggie, I really want to try. I studied his face. There was no dramatic declaration. No grand gesture. Just an exhausted man finally admitting that his fear had damaged the people he loved. That was more believable to me than any romantic speech could have been. Still, I wasn't ready to simply return to normal. I need some time, I said. He nodded. How much? I don't know. He swallowed. Do you want me to leave? I thought about it. Yes. His face fell. But not forever. He nodded. I can stay with my brother for a few days. That would be good. He stood. Before leaving the kitchen, he stopped. I love you. I didn't answer immediately. Then I said I love you too. He looked relieved. But love isn't the problem. He nodded. Trust is. That afternoon I called Susan. I told her about Daniel's plans for France. She listened carefully. Then she reminded me of something simple. Don't make permanent financial decisions while you're emotionally exhausted. I won't. And don't let anyone pressure you into signing anything. I won't. She paused. You know, Maggie, protecting yourself doesn't mean you're trying to punish your husband. I know. Good. After I hung up, I sat in my living room and looked around. For the first time, I noticed how much of the house belonged to me. The books on the shelves, the photographs, the quilt my mother made, the little ceramic bird sitting beside the fireplace. I had spent so much time worrying about what I might lose that I had forgotten what I had already built. That evening, I went for a walk. I passed the library where I had volunteered for years. The next morning, I was scheduled to help with a French conversation group for retirees. I almost canceled. Then I decided not to. I showed up. There were 8 people sitting around a long table. Some knew almost no French. Others had studied it decades earlier. One elderly man told me he had learned French while stationed in Europe after the Korean War. A woman named Ruth said she wanted to practice because she was planning a trip to Paris with her daughter. For an hour, nobody asked me about Daniel. Nobody knew about Henri and Colette. Nobody cared about the inheritance. I was simply Maggie, the French teacher, the woman helping people pronounce words they hadn't used in 40 years. And I realized how much I had missed being that person. Over the next few weeks, Daniel did exactly what he said he would do. He stayed with his brother. He met with an independent financial advisor. He closed the secret account. He gave me copies of every financial statement. Most importantly, he stopped making promises and started making changes. Henri and Colette changed too. Colette called me one afternoon. She didn't ask about Daniel. She asked if I liked apple pie. I laughed. Why? I want to learn how you make it. You've eaten French pastries your whole life. Yes, she said, but I want to learn something American. So I invited her over. She arrived with a notebook. We stood together in my kitchen measuring cinnamon and sugar. For the first time, we spoke without suspicion. Not because everything was forgiven, because we were finally learning who the other person actually was. Before she left, Colette said something that stayed with me. You know, Maggie, I thought I was protecting my son. I know, but I was protecting the version of him that existed in my head. I looked at her. She continued. I didn't see the man he had become. I understood. And maybe that was what all of us had been doing. Henri had treated Daniel like a boy. Daniel had behaved like one. I had tried to fix things for everyone. And his parents had decided I was the villain before ever asking me who I was. We were all going to have to change. A month later, Daniel asked me to meet him for dinner. He didn't ask me to come home. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He simply said, I want to show you something. At the restaurant, he handed me a folder. Inside was a new estate plan prepared by an independent Ohio attorney. Everything was transparent. My rights were protected. His inheritance remained his separate property, and there were no secret provisions written overseas. I looked at him. You did this yourself. Yes. Why? Because you shouldn't have to discover what I'm doing anymore. I closed the folder. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not certainty. Not blind trust. Hope. And sometimes at our age, hope is the most honest beginning you can ask for. The first time Daniel came back to our house, he didn't bring flowers. He brought groceries. A loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, fresh apples, coffee. It was such an ordinary thing that it nearly broke my heart. He stood at the front door holding 2 paper bags and looked at me. I didn't know what to bring. I smiled faintly. Groceries are fine. He stepped inside. Nothing about that afternoon felt like the old version of our marriage. We weren't pretending everything was fixed. We weren't avoiding the hard conversations either. We were simply trying to learn how to be honest. That turned out to be harder than either of us expected. Daniel had always been good at avoiding conflict. If I asked him whether something bothered him, he'd say, I'm fine. If his parents called with an opinion, he'd say, I'll handle it. If money was tight, he'd quietly move things around instead of telling me. He had mistaken silence for peace. Now he was learning that silence could be destructive. We began meeting with a marriage counselor. The counselor didn't take sides. That was important. She asked Daniel why he had lied to his parents. He said because I was afraid they'd be disappointed. Then she asked why he had lied to me. He looked at me. Because I was afraid she'd be disappointed too. The counselor nodded. So you created 2 different versions of yourself. Daniel swallowed. Yes. And eventually those versions collided. He looked down. Yes. I reached over and touched his hand. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was recognition. I understood something about him that I hadn't understood before. Daniel wasn't malicious. He was afraid. And fear, when left unchecked for years, can make a decent person behave terribly. That didn't erase what he had done. But it gave me a place to begin. Meanwhile, Henri and Colette stayed in Ohio another month. They had originally planned to remain only 2 weeks. Now they seemed reluctant to leave. Colette and I developed a strange friendship. Not the kind where we called every day. Not yet. But she began asking about my life, my childhood, my mother, my years teaching French. One afternoon she found an old photograph of me standing outside a school in Ohio. You were a teacher for 22 years. She looked surprised. Daniel never told us. I laughed softly. Daniel didn't tell either of us very much. She smiled. That was the first time we laughed together without tension. Henri was slower. He remained formal. But he started helping Daniel around the house. One Saturday morning, I found the two of them in the garage repairing a broken shelf. I stood in the doorway. Henri looked at me. I made the shelf worse. I laughed. Daniel smiled. I told him to leave it alone. Henri shook his head. You Americans have strange ideas about tools. I raised an eyebrow. You flew across an ocean to criticize our tools. He laughed. It was small, but it mattered. The family was beginning to change. Not because anyone had forgotten what happened, because everyone had finally stopped pretending it hadn't happened. Then one evening Colette asked to speak with me privately. We sat on the back porch. The sun was going down. I want to tell you something, she said. I waited. Henri was angry with Daniel for helping Claire. I know, but there was more. What? He was afraid Claire would ask for more. I nodded. That explains the secrecy. Yes. She took a breath. Daniel told us that you would be furious if you knew. I looked at her. He said that. Yes. I sighed. That wasn't true. I know now. She looked toward the yard. You know what I finally understood? What? You weren't trying to take Daniel away from us. No. We were pushing you away because we thought you were. I nodded. That happens in families. She looked at me. Do you forgive me? The question caught me off guard. I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, I'm trying. She nodded. That is enough. I appreciated that. Because forgiveness isn't always a door you open all at once. Sometimes it's a hallway. You walk down it slowly. You stop when you're tired. You keep going when you're ready. Daniel and I continued working on our marriage. We also changed our financial habits. We had separate accounts. We had a joint household account. We met once a month to review bills and investments. No secrets, no assumptions. No envelopes hidden in desk drawers. And Daniel finally told his parents something he should have told them years earlier. My marriage is not a family vote. Henri didn't like hearing it, but he accepted it. That was progress. Several months later, Daniel asked me if I would consider going to France with him. I looked at him. For how long? 3 weeks. 3. He smiled. I thought we'd start small. I laughed. Good answer. We planned the trip together. Not his parents, not me. Us. Before we left, I visited Susan one last time. She reviewed our updated estate documents and told me everything was in order. I thanked her. Then she said, You know, Maggie, a lot of people your age are afraid to ask questions about money because they don't want to appear suspicious. I understand. Don't ever confuse financial independence with mistrust. I thought about that. It was an important lesson, especially later in life. Love doesn't require blindness. Marriage doesn't require surrendering your financial awareness. And family doesn't give anyone the right to make decisions for you. When we finally flew to France, I sat beside Daniel on the plane. He reached for my hand. I took it. Neither of us said much. There was no need. When we arrived, Henri and Colette were waiting. Colette hugged me. Henri shook my hand. Then he said in English, Welcome home. I smiled. This isn't my home. He smiled back. Maybe not yet. I laughed. For the first time, the French language wasn't a weapon between us. It was simply a language. We spent 3 weeks traveling, eating in little restaurants, visiting markets, and listening to Henri tell stories about Daniel as a boy. Some of those stories were embarrassing. Daniel deserved it. I told a few stories of my own. We laughed. We disagreed, we learned. And somewhere between one ordinary conversation and another, I realized something. I had spent months thinking my revenge would be proving them wrong. But I had been wrong. The real victory wasn't making Henri feel guilty. It wasn't making Colette apologize. It wasn't making Daniel choose me over his parents. The real victory was refusing to let their fear turn me into someone I didn't want to become. When we returned to Ohio, our marriage wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was honest. And that was worth more than perfection. One evening, several months later, we sat around our kitchen table again. The same table, the same 4 chairs. But everything felt different. Colette was helping me make apple pie. Henri was drinking coffee. Daniel was washing dishes. Colette looked at me and smiled. I still can't believe you understood us that first night. I laughed. I told you, French wasn't the secret you thought it was. Henri shook his head. No, the secret was that we didn't know you at all. I looked around the table, and for the first time I knew exactly what I had won. Not money. Not revenge. Something much better. The truth.